careful, please. That elite was an ultra.
So, a while back, I went to this institute class, which was called World Religions, and surprise, surprise, I didn't like it that much. It's basically diversity training, just talking about weird Hindu religions and stuff, which could, in theory, be really interesting. It was just a weird class. It could be worse. A friend of mine told me that in his college town, they had a class called Yoga Deeply Rooted in Christ or something like that. You know, the Christians are probably right that yoga is like channeling demonic energy, some sort of ancient poop devil. You know, it's just not for us as Westerners. It's not something we should do. If you are Hindu, then that's fine. Go ahead. So what does that have to do with anything? Well, you know, the Hindus, they believe in reincarnation. Just like the word translation, I think that we can get kind of locked into a very particular meaning. Perhaps God's language is perfectly efficient and conveys meaning perfectly, but our languages do not do this. When Eliza R. Snow talks about this idea of reincarnation, obviously she had a very specific understanding of the exact mechanics, and it's almost impossible to know. The term reincarnation could mean anything from getting reincarnated as a beetle to something as basic as what the three Nephites did, being like a ministering angel. It's that broad. And so I just wanted to explore some ideas and kind of put on our reincarnation lenses to examine the endowment and see what we could learn. You'll have to forgive me for being so esoteric in this discussion. Obviously, if you know, you know. If you don't know, don't listen to this, okay? I'm trying to thread the needle here of, you know, preserving my eternal soul and also sharing things that I feel must be shared. Modern Mormonism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has created this anti-speculation culture. And I feel like this is antithetical to who we are. We gotta be willing to pour the milk before the cereal just to see what happens sometimes. And I'm not talking about like exploring yourself, like that's gay, but just playing with different ideas, seeing how they taste, seeing how they fit. And that's how we go about building our testimony, building our theology. It is to glean the truth from wherever it comes, to learn about this original, ancient religion. That is what the religion of Christ was. Our religion is the pursuit of the truth, and so who's Christian now? So reincarnation. What does reincarnation have to do with Mormonism? And the truth is that there are some statements that have to do with reincarnation that are from the early saints. Eliza R. Snow comes to mind specifically, and we know that she was a close confidant of Joseph Smith, considering she was married to him. Anyway, so I want to read a couple of these quotes, these sources about reincarnation, to kind of get everyone on the same page with what's going on here. We'll have a discussion about it and see what we can learn. And then we can go back to believing whatever we believed, or maybe we learn something new. Here's Joseph Lee Robinson. He says, "We also heard him say that God had revealed unto him that any man who ever committed adultery in either of his probations, that man could never be raised to the highest exaltation in the celestial glory, and that he felt anxious with regard to himself. And he inquired of the Lord, and the Lord told him that he, Joseph, had never committed adultery. This saying of the prophet astonished me very much. It opened me up to a very wide field of reflection. The idea that we had passed through probation prior to this, and that we must have been married and given in marriage in those probations, or there would be no propriety in making such an assertion, and that there were several exaltations in the celestial kingdom of God. The highest we supposed to be the Godhead, and we conclude that there are several grades of exaltations in servants to the gods. But this, as it may, this is what he said. We will know the truth of the matter someday." And that kind of gets into the idea of the celestial kingdom having different degrees of glory even within it, which I think we've all heard that before, but we don't really know where it comes from. Here's another quote. It says, "During our talks, he, Lorenzo Snow, told me that his sister, the late Eliza R. Snow Smith, was a firm believer in the principle of reincarnation, and that she claimed to have received it from Joseph the prophet, her husband. He said he saw nothing unreasonable in it, and could believe it if it came from him from the Lord or his oracle." Anyway, that's enough reading sources. So what's going on with that? Should we pay any attention to that? I don't know. It's probably not particularly important, but I'd like to explore it. There's value in all truth, and any truth that we can find is good, so I think it's always worth looking for. When I was first introduced to this idea, I thought, okay, well, if it's true, then it should be in the endowment, because the endowment is the place that teaches us all about this life, the pre-earth life, and the life to come. And so if multiple mortal probations, which is what this doctrine is called, the idea of multiple mortal probations, if that's true, then it will be taught in the endowment. If you subscribe to this Ancient of Days theology, then obviously in that sense there are multiple mortal probations, inasmuch as, Adam was mortal. Are there others? Perhaps when you go through the temple, there's a series of steps, and throughout these steps you are receiving different names, and you are robing and disrobing, and each time you re-robe, you are robing with a higher and higher glory. And when you take this in context with multiple mortal probations, and I have no idea if there is a break-off group that teaches something like this, or if this is like a commonly understood thing about the endowment. I assume that it would be, because I thought of it. I don't think that it's that out there. I think it's the obvious interpretation of the endowment in light of these ideas of reincarnation, but maybe this is unique. I don't know. I have no idea. But this is just my thoughts. So yeah, in the endowment, you're given a name, and this is a secret name. That's the first one you receive. And after, you get another name, and this is a name that is not secret. I mean, you're not supposed to reveal it, but it's not a secret name. And I think it's interesting that the secret name is given first. What was my name in the pre-existence? And it's almost like we are given a name that represents that. We're told never to reveal it. In the same way that our true name, our name from the pre-existence, is a name that even we do not know. It is totally secret and hidden. When you think about the second name, and that the secret name comes before that, in the temple we go to the veil and answer a series of questions, and provided that this is something that will literally happen to me if I am someday at the gates of heaven being asked questions, when it comes to giving the secret name, I'm not exactly certain if I'm supposed to give the name that I received in the temple, or if I'm supposed to give my name from the pre-existence. And that's just something that's always concerned me. Now, I'm not even certain that when I get to the gate of heaven and I have to talk to these sentinels or whatever, I'm not sure if I will at that point even remember the pre-existence. So if that's the case, then obviously the temple name is the way to go. But who knows? Maybe if I'd done my homework, then I would know my name from the pre-existence. Just something to think about there. What all this name business means. Is it random? I don't think that it is. I think that it has super deep importance that is probably very symbolic and in some cases literal. And the only way that you're ever going to figure that out is by thinking about it, because no one's ever going to tell you what it means, apparently. That's the point of this exercise. Then, third, we're given yet another name. And this is where things start to get a little controversial and perhaps blasphemous. But I guess there's this idea that Christ was God before he came to earth. And how is that possible? Because the way that the plan of salvation is laid out to us is, well, God had a body, we didn't have a body, God created a plan so that we could become like him and get a body and become like God, and we need to get a body to become like God. But Jesus was always God, and Jesus didn't have a body, and it's like, well, if Jesus could become God without getting a body, why couldn't we? Well, Jesus is different than you. Well, we're told he's just our brother. So I guess there's this idea that Christ perhaps has had earlier probations, and he's further along in these things. And perhaps in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. When Christ came to earth, did he have to remove his divine godly robes in order to be born into a mortal coil once again? And then through the resurrection, he was able to be re-robed in yet an even higher level of godly robes. This is kind of going back to that idea of there being multiple degrees in the kingdoms of glory. Like the idea that the three kingdoms of glory is a gross oversimplification, and that even within the celestial kingdom, which is all those who partake in God's life and help to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man, there are many different jobs that one could be given to help participate in that. And those are the many degrees. That's how I'm thinking about it in the context of this thought experiment. This is where it gets really blasphemous and a little hard to stomach. But have no fear. It's just a thought experiment. So then there's this idea that maybe in the future, obviously this would be a very small amount of the people who live on this earth, but they would have an opportunity to live a life that is somewhat similar to the life that Christ lived on earth. Just a thought. That would make sense in how Christ was God before we were ever born in spirit. He's always been God. Just a thought I had. So, is that what it means to participate in God's life? Because that is, in essence, the core message of Mormonism. It is a kind of different and more literal take on that ancient Christian doctrine of theosis that is brought into a new, different light. Theosis is this idea of becoming more like God, and as restorationists, we believe in the idea of living God's life. And so is this what it means? What kind of a life does God live? Do you think it's all wine and ambrosia and clouds and harps? Is that what it means? No. We know that God came down to earth and he treaded out the winepress. He was there in the garden. Now, we may not agree on exactly who was in the garden, but we know he was in the garden doing work. We can all agree on that. And when you start to think these thoughts, you're like, is this the logical conclusion of that idea put forth in the King Follett Discourse that we are ontologically the same type of being as God? Because if it's not possible, then I would say that we are not co-eternal with God. We are not the same sort of thing as God. We're something else. If it is not possible to participate in a life that is like the life that God lived. And if we aren't the same, which is the Christian position, then it would make sense that we would never live that type of life. I don't see why a handful of the most noble and great would not have that opportunity. Or maybe more than a handful. I don't want to put limits on God's power and his ability to redeem his children and glorify his children and to be able to purify and refine them. I don't want to put limits on that. So this fourth name, it's secret and sacred, so obviously I can't talk about it too much, but it's the idea of the name of the Ancient of Days. It's kind of this idea of eternal fruitfulness, kind of like the Abrahamic promise of becoming the father of many nations, raising up posterity and refining them and helping these lesser intelligences to become greater and to be elevated like unto him and to help exalt them. And that is his work and his glory. And so that is the final name that we receive. Another question I have with the temple that is kind of related to the idea of multiple mortal probations, and that is, what is up with the fig leaf apron? Why are there 9 fig leaves on it? Why 9? And we put it on 3 times, which is, a multiple of 9. And I've heard in the Mysteries of Godliness book that he says that in the past there was even more of the robe changes involved in the endowment, and I would be extremely interested in being able to see that, though I don't know if that's exactly possible to even know when or where or how many total. Maybe there were 9. I don't know. That would be, if there were 9, then that would make a lot of sense. But yeah, there's 3 of them. But we put this apron on 3 times, or I guess now it's only 2. But you keep it on even when you're admitted into God's presence, into the celestial room. As you go through the gate of heaven, this veil, it would make sense to me that as you are admitted into the presence of the celestial room, that it would be appropriate to remove this apron that is kind of representative of the fall, kind of representative of mortality, and yet we don't. But in light of this idea of God's life being a life of repeated condescensions to earth, it makes a lot more sense. And yeah, so that's just some thoughts that I had. I mean, I hope that I'm being respectful of the promises that I've made in the temple, so I don't want to be disrespectful at all, but I think that exploring these sorts of topics is required. It's required if we want to increase in understanding. That's just a random thought that I had. We put on the robes, we take the robes off. We put on the robes, we take the robes off. And what is that all about? It feels very deliberate. It feels very important. And that was just a potential thought that I had. And without converting to one of the fringe groups, it's very difficult to learn a lot of the oral traditions about the endowment because it's very hush-hush. And so it's not written in books. It's not really shared. It's all preserved in whispers. So very difficult to learn about, but those were some thoughts, and I hope that helps you think about the endowment in a different light. It's a ritual that we are encouraged to participate in monthly, and so I think that having different ways to look at it and to learn about it is important so that we don't get kind of tunnel vision on what it means. We can just be open to new things, and that is how new light and knowledge can be given our way, is this kind of humility and openness to the idea of being wrong or just trying to reach for something higher. I think that when we do that, that's knocking, that's seeking, and the promise is that we shall find. So some thoughts, no idea if they're true or not. It would be interesting, makes a lot of sense. I'm not exactly sure what all these potter's clay comments mean, or what exactly Eliza R. Snow was referring to when she said that Joseph Smith believed in reincarnation. It could refer to something huge, that we're going to be reincarnated thousands of times, or what is participating in God's life look like? Well, it looks a lot like what Adam and Eve did for us. You know, it may be as simple as that. So I don't want to assume anything, but I don't want to doubt anything. Those were just my thoughts on the idea of multiple mortal probations. I hope that was thought-provoking, and have a good one.